He conquered half the known world before the age of 32. Then suddenly he was dead. Was it poison, disease, or betrayal? It's one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. This is the death of Alexander the Great. This is a special long-form episode of a series exploring the strange and mysterious deaths of history's biggest names. If you love legendary lost tales, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an epic episode. And if you want to dive deeper into history's biggest mysteries, be sure to check out the companion podcast, where each week we bring you all new stories of legendary lost tales. You can listen and subscribe for free on various platforms. Now, let's get into the death of Alexander the Great. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander III of Macedonia, better known as Alexander the Great, hosted a feast for his exhausted army. After years of unrelenting campaigns across Persia, Egypt, and into India, they had finally made it to Babylon, the jewel of the Mesopotamian empires. Alexander planned to use the city as his new capital and set about making it even grander than before. In fact, the city was so magnificent that, according to legend, when he first arrived, he fell down drunk after getting lost in its magnificent gardens. So it was fitting that his soldiers would relax here after their grueling campaign. But something was off. Many of them were weary, not just from campaigning, but from the continual threat of illness. A few weeks earlier, the men had fought against King Paris near the Indian city of Bees, and although Alexander won a great victory, he lost something far more valuable, his health. On the long march through India, thousands of his troops died of exhaustion and exposure, while many more succumbed to deadly diseases. That wasn't enough to slow Alexander down, however. He continued to press on until his body gave way. Back in Babylon, despite all the riches of the empire at his command, his physicians could do little to help him. As historian Plutarch wrote, the fever continued to rage and he grew rapidly worse, being unable to get a night's rest, tossing and turning in his bed, groaning and muttering in his delirium, speaking in a strange language, as some said. With every passing day, Alexander grew weaker, eventually being unable to get out of bed. At first, his counselors kept watch over him, but as his condition worsened, they became alarmed. What if he died? What would happen to his vast empire? Even his closest advisors began to sneak out, leaving only two of his most trusted generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus, at his side. One day, when Alexander tried to speak, his tongue was so swollen that no words came out. All he could do was write on pieces of parchment. At first, these notes dealt with mundane matters such as minor administrative issues. But later, as he slipped in and out of consciousness, his thoughts turned to his legacy. First, he asked that his body be buried next to his beloved horse, Bucephalus, a noble beast that he had tamed as a young man. Second, he expressed his wish to have his friend and teacher, Aristotle, summoned from Athens to care for his dying wish. Finally, knowing that he did not have much time left, he summoned his former tutor and wrote out instructions for the education of his infant son, Alexander IV. With that done, he placed his head in Ptolemy's lap, looked up at his general and said, "My kingdom is not a small one for you to inherit." And with that, Alexander the Great died. Was it poison? Almost immediately, rumors began spreading that Alexander might have been murdered. One likely suspect was his wife, Roxana, whose honor he had besmirched. When he made his way to the Indian subcontinent, he became enamored with the local culture and took a number of local women as his lovers. He even married a 16-year-old Bactrian princess named Roxana. But later, when he married another local princess, Barsine, he sent Roxana away, which may have motivated her to seek revenge. Another possible poisoning culprit was the Parthian king Darius, who sought to avenge his father's honor. When King Darius III was defeated by Alexander at the Battle of Issus, he fled to Babylon. There, he hoped to raise an army and defeat Alexander once and for all. But Alexander invaded before Darius could assemble his forces. Though Darius did escape, his family members were captured and held hostage in Babylon. Alexander reportedly wanted to kill Darius on sight. And so when Darius's brother, Bessus, showed up in the Macedonian camp asking for mercy, he had him put to death. That's why there was certainly bad blood between the two families. Some historians even blame Attalus, a Macedonian general who plotted against Alexander early in his reign. However, none of these suspects ever faced trial because it was never proven that Alexander was poisoned. Fever. The idea that Alexander died from a fever caused by malaria or typhoid isn't as popular as the poisoning theory, but it does have its merits. Alexander had already contracted malaria in 334 BC while campaigning in the region that is now Turkey. Malaria is a parasitic infection transmitted by mosquitoes, and symptoms can develop quickly, include fever, chills, sweating, headache, nausea, fatigue, and even death. Typhoid, on the other hand, is a bacterial infection that enters the body through food or water and remains in the digestive system, causing constipation or diarrhea, high fever, headache, and abdominal pain. Given that both diseases are spread via consumption and that Alexander was recently in a region rife with disease, either is a viable option. Additionally, he showed a lot of the symptoms associated with each illness, including fever, chills, aches, pains, weakness, and a loss of appetite. However, without modern medical equipment, it was impossible to determine what was truly plaguing Alexander. Was it malaria, typhoid, or something else entirely? Unfortunately, history can't tell us. Autoimmune disease. While this theory is highly speculative, some historians believe that Alexander may have died from an autoimmune disease. Around the time of his death, he displayed some of the symptoms of both Guillain-Barré syndrome and acute transverse myelitis. Guillain-Barré syndrome causes inflammation of the brain and spinal cord, leading to muscle weakness and eventually paralysis. Meanwhile, acute transverse myelitis is an inflammation of the spinal cord that can cause similar problems with mobility. Both conditions are usually brought on by a viral infection, which Alexander certainly had during his campaigns. However, without further evidence, it's impossible to say whether or not this was the true cause of Alexander's death. Aftermath. Regardless of how he died, Alexander's passing sent his empire into chaos. It's important to remember that Alexander didn't really have any formal heirs. Before his death, he had designated his infant son as his successor, but the boy was barely alive. That meant that the real power in the empire would fall to the Diadochi, Alexander's group of generals. Unfortunately, not everyone got along, and soon the empire would be embroiled in a series of brutal civil wars as rival factions competed for control. The wars of the Diadochi would last for almost a century, ending with the empire divided among several successor states. And while Alexander's empire would eventually come back together under the rule of his son, Alexander IV, the boy was just 12 years old at the time of his accession, and his mother, Roxana, was forced to flee for her life. Alexander IV would die just 4 years later, having survived longer than many expected, but not long enough to heal the wounds within his family or his empire. Legacy. It's hard to overstate just how significant Alexander the Great was to world history. In his short lifetime, he founded over 70 cities, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and defeated many powerful enemies. But perhaps his greatest legacy is the mystery surrounding his death. It's hard not to wonder if Alexander had lived longer, what he might have accomplished. Would he have taken his empire all the way to China? Would he have pushed into Western Europe? Or would he have gone on to conquer the entirety of India? We may never know the answer to those questions. So was Alexander the Great poisoned, infected, or struck down by an autoimmune disease? The simple answer is we don't know, and it may never be possible to prove one theory over the other. What we do know is that Alexander built an empire in life and left a mystery in death. Thank you for watching. What do you think happened to Alexander the Great? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to check out the companion podcast, where every week we bring you all new stories of legendary lost tales. You can listen and subscribe for free on various platforms.